This program is brought to you by the Reeves Law Firm, www.reevesfirm.com.
In the know.
Good evening, everyone.
In the know. Tony Reeves, fire. Following the news in any way, shape, or form. No shortage of things to talk about. What does it mean? What will it bring? Is this a reality we simply have to accept? Tony Reeves, fire. Tony Reeves.
Let's go ahead and get started.
It is very important that you understand the power of being consistent with regards to explaining what things that are in your medical records that support, and not only just your medical records and support in your file, to support your allegations that you believe that you're disabled. So let's talk about this for a few. For those of you who are like, what do you mean by consistency? Typically what Social Security is looking at is they're looking at whether or not there's a flow for how your evidence supports. Meaning, what do you mean by that? Meaning, is everything kind of in line with this? Meaning, saying, let's take a good example. Let's say you're saying, okay, I think it's dry outside. Okay, you go outside, you touch the ground's dry. You look up in the sky, it's not raining. You put your hand on different items around the yard, and you're like, oh, okay, everything is dry. So guess what? Everything consistently supports that it's dry outside. Same thing, when you're saying in particular that you have a particular limitation that disables you. It's not so much the fact that you're saying is it consistent you being found disabled. It's really is it consistent in terms of what you say you can and you cannot do. So what does Social Security rely upon to determine whether or not what you're saying you can and can't do? What are they relying upon in determining consistency? They're looking at what your medical records say. They're looking at what you're saying. They're looking at what other people are saying about you, and they're also looking at if there's any other documents in your files that may give them an indication of whether or not you're consistent in what your limitations are. So if you're going to the doctor and you're saying that your back's hurting and that you're having difficulty bending over, and then you're writing a statement later for Social Security indicating that your back hurts, you have a problem bending over, and then people who know you write a statement saying, oh yeah, he's got problems with his back, he has a hard time bending over. And then there's other documents in there. Let's say that you applied for food stamps or you applied for some assistance, and in there was a physician statement that said, yeah, the claimant is saying that their back hurts, they have a hard time bending over. Consistency. They're looking to see whether or not the information that's being provided is consistent to support what you're saying. Tripped up as they're asking what's considered an inconsistency. That's when one document or statement says one thing, but then another document or statement says the opposite or something completely different. So for instance, if you're sitting here and you're saying that, oh, I can't bend over, my back hurts, and then somebody else writes a third-party statement on your behalf saying, oh, he didn't have any problem bending. Well, guess what? That's an inconsistency because you got one thing saying one thing, you got one other thing saying something completely different. People ask me, well, what other things should I be thinking about? Well, what you say you can and can't do as opposed to what you're actually doing. For instance, if you sit there and they ask you, do you have any problems with pushing, pulling, lifting, bending, crouching, crawling, and so forth like that, and you say, oh yeah, I got problems with all those, but then you start filling out information like, okay, well, do you cook? Oh yeah, I cook all the time. You know, I'm able to cook full meals and so forth. Well, the presumption is that, well, if you're going to cook, that means you're going to have to bend over to get into the stove. You're going to have to bend over to get your pots and pans. Do you do any house cleaning? Sure do. Okay, well, you just said that you can't do any bending. If you're going to do any house cleaning, you got to clean the toilet. That requires bending. Tub requires bending. Sink requires bending. Floor requires bending. See what I'm saying? So you're sitting here, or you're saying, you can't bend, you can't crouch or crawl. Do you do any gardening? Yeah. I have a garden in the backyard, and I go out and I pick the weeds by hand. Guess what? Unless the weeds are up to your chest, you're probably getting on your knees and your hands and your hands and knees and actually pulling those up. So they're looking at, this is what you're saying you can and can't do in terms of what you're limited, but then your activities is telling them something different. So then people really get mad. And they're like, well, what am I supposed to do? Explain. And you're like, that's it? That's it. At the end of the day, it all comes down to explain. Explain how you do things in detail. What happens is that we do things by muscle memory. We do it so often we don't think about it. Think about it. You go in a room and it's dark. You don't think about turning the light on. You turn the light on because muscle memory, it just comes instinctively. So what happens is that when you become disabled, you have a new normal. So you need to explain what that new normal is. Explain how you do things in detail. If you know you clean up the bathroom, but by cleaning up the bathroom, all you do is wipe down the sink and your son or your niece or your best friend takes care of washing the toilet and cleaning the sink and and cleaning the floor and everything. If you don't tell Social Security that, they won't know that. Same thing. Tell the doctors exactly what you can and you can't do. Don't sugarcoat it. And 'cause what happens is sometimes we tend to gloss over those things. You want to be detailed. Explain, 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 so that this way they have a complete understanding. Make sure you give Social Security the name of a person who can accurately speak about your limitations. Now, this has come up. Sometimes you're not going to have somebody like that. And that's just the reality. You can't make somebody be what they are, they're not. But it's important that if you are in a situation where you have a loved one that can speak to your circumstances, give them the name of a person who has seen you on enough frequency in terms of seeing what you do on a day-to-day basis, so that this way they can give an accurate reflection of what you can and you can't do. Just not somebody who's basically sees you every now and then and doesn't see you when you're having these problems. And then more important, be prepared to explain any inconsistencies. People, the Social Security process can be a long process in terms of it could be a few months, it could be a few years. You're not going to remember probably what you wrote back in 2 years ago when you first started, as opposed to when you go before a judge. Just know this: typically you are the best witness. You're typically, if you know your body. So if the judge asks you, how is it that you said you can't do A, B, C, and D, but you do A, B, C, and D, and you know this is your new normal? If you know that you used to cook full course meals, but now as opposed to doing them on your own, you have to sit down, you have to talk your kids through it because you can't stand at the stove. Instead of cutting the different things and instead of cutting the different vegetables and things that you normally would do before, you now have to kind of be strategic and have them do them for you. Guess what? You're not doing it the way you used to. So you need to be prepared to explain those inconsistencies. Remember, this is your new normal now. So if Social Security doesn't have a complete explanation of how things are operating in your world, they can only go by what they had. Remember, you bear the burden of proving you're disabled. You don't want the government to have to figure out anything. You want to explain it to them so that it's clear enough so that it removes all doubt about the limitations you have and your application for disability benefits.